my lawyer, I had to keep calling him and having him explain to me, because I said I didn't kill anybody. What are you talking about?
It's easier to convict someone of felony murder than it is manslaughter. It's easier to convict someone of felony murder than it is in a wrongful death suit.
At its core, the felony-murder rule is the idea that if you take part in a felony in which someone is killed, you can be convicted of murder. So often when we think of someone who murdered someone, we're thinking in terms of the actual shooter, the actual stabber, however the murder happened. Under the felony murder rule, if you agreed to participate in some felony, and in the course of the felony someone dies, whether it's the person you were robbing, or a co-defendant, or a police officer, or a bystander, whether or not you had a gun or any sort of weapon, you can be convicted under the rule.
I've always been skeptical about the fairness of the felony rule. I think it's a prosecutor's tool, and it fails to demand discriminating fact-finding by the jury.
One begins to think about one of the fundamental principles in our law, which is proportionality. So the punishment should fit the crime and the mental state that the individual had at the time. And again, the felony murder rule undermines our sense of proportionality. It undermines it both with regard to sentencing, but it undermines it with regard to the parole board as well.
The board does take a look in terms of what is the role that this person played, okay? Let's say, for instance, using that same example, you ask me for a ride to the store, all right? And I give you a ride to the store, and you go in the store, and not only rob the store, but you murder somebody. Am I culpable? Well, under the law, I am. But what is the actual degree of my involvement? I'm just an innocent person who just gave you a ride to the store. And so I think that in instances like that, the parole board takes a look in terms of what is this actual person's involvement in this crime, okay? And how much, for lack of a better term, how much liability do I assign to this person as opposed to maybe the person who was the actual perpetrator?
The parole board, the felony murder rule is something that the parole board is well aware of. There is a lot of discussion at the interview and afterwards with the parole board members after the inmate leaves the room. During the interview, there may be an intensive focus on what this individual's actions were. Even though an individual didn't actually commit the act that caused the death, the parole board is very aware that sometimes they could have really helped that act to have occurred. Also, the parole board would take a look at why didn't you ask the question of the inmate, why didn't you stop this? What prevented you from telling this individual, don't do this? And the inmate should be prepared to answer a lot of detailed questions about that. And also, just the fact that the inmate was there with the person who may have committed the actual act could have encouraged the actor, the bad actor, to commit the crime. Also, the parole board will consider, as part of the circumstances, who that person was at the time of the offense. What was the age of the person? What was the background of the person? Why was he or she running around with this group of people that did this? The parole board has to make a determination, is there a reasonable probability that if released, will this person live and remain at liberty without violating the law? So if you're part of an act, and maybe not an overt part of an act, and you couple that with a good institutional record since incarceration, maybe, again, achievement of some skills that you didn't have when you were out in the street running around with these people, that's all part of the continuum that the parole board will consider in their discussions after the inmate leaves the room.
My sentence was 15 to life for felony murder. I appeared before 6 boards before I was granted parole.
You go before the parole board, and they have no interest in the differing levels of culpability. They're not going to weigh that. And you go to the parole board at 15 years, and you're denied. And you go to the parole board at 17 years, and you're denied. And you go to the parole board in succession until you've been there for 25 years. And you're now serving the same sentence as the person who did the stabbing. And you've been sandbagged.
We have the same issue that's presented with the problems with the felony murder rule, because in the questionnaire, the categories aren't distinguished. As when you check what a person is convicted of, the only thing that covers anybody with any murder or manslaughter, negligent homicide, is homicide on the test. So when you're doing the risk assessment test, it doesn't distinguish your culpability level.
Now, I know that there are presently some effort to try to change some of the parole decision-making process. When we look in terms of the seriousness of the crime, oftentimes that every time a person comes up for parole, that the board will use that as an excuse for not to release that person. Under some new efforts to try to change the parole decision-making process, that people are saying, okay, fine, there should be a limit in terms of how often you can use that to prevent a person from being released. That is the seriousness of the crime.
For me, in my practice, the problem is that these individuals are being held at the same standard as the actual individual who committed the act of murder or the injury that led to a murder. And if they try to explain their role in the crime, they're often penalized for that. And you'll see in a decision where it's stated that they minimized their role in the crime.
The parole board sandbags you again and again and again. This is an everyday occurrence in our parole system, and it's one of the, it is the administrative side of the inhumanity and unfairness of the felony murder rule.
I pray all the time for the people that I left behind because I fear for them. And I've left people behind that I know committed crimes as bad as mine, worse than mine, maybe not quite as bad, but they had sentences like mine. And they're being denied just like I was. 1, 2, 3 times. They're up to now, headed for 4. One girl I left behind is going to her 8th parole board at the beginning of next year. And they still won't let her out. And she does nothing but continue to do well and become a better person and rehabilitate herself. So I pray that somehow, some way, a change is made and they are forced to look at who the person has become and not just the offense.
I began studying what other people were saying who were ex-judges, who were former prosecutors, who were law professors, and heard what they had to say about how unjust the felony murder rule actually is. So from that point, I started to advocate from their perspective on my own behalf. And even though a lot of people would tell me, well, listen, you have an enormous mountain to climb because the law is the law. I wasn't deterred because I believe that if enough people knew how unjust and unconstitutional this rule actually is, that they would support its reform and even abolishment.